Masechet Avoda Zara Daf Lamed Het Vehashelakot. The Mishnah mentioned that boiled vegetables prepared by Goyim are prohibited for a Jew to eat. And this is true even if all the ingredients, just vegetables or some spices, whatever it is, even if all the ingredients are kosher, it's not a matter of kosher, but rather this is called bishule goyim or bishule akum because it is cooked by a non-Jew. And the reason seems to be that this will lessen social interaction, social intimacy by not eating foods that are cooked by non-Jews. But there are many different parts of the definition of what's included in this prohibition and not, and that's the discussion today. We begin with the question, what's the source for this prohibition? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kera Ochel bakesef tashbireni ve'achalti umayim bakesef titenli ve'shatiti Kemayim. Mamayim shelo nishtanu, af ochel shelo nishtana. Rabbi Yochanan says the source is from Moshe's request from Sichon, the king of the Emori. He says, we're going to pass through your land. Can we have permission? He asks. And don't worry, we're not going to take anything from you. You can sell me food for money so that we can eat. And give me water for money that we can drink. So you see that Moshe and Bnei Israel are going to eat the food and drink the water of Sichon. However, they can't just eat anything that is given to them. Rather, there's a comparison between the food and the water. Just like water is something that doesn't change. Even if you cook water, it doesn't change its form, so it's in raw form. So too, food has to be in raw form, unchanged. And so we learn from here that one can only eat raw food that is gotten from a non-Jew, but not cooked food. So now we ask, according to this definition, it has to be something that's not changed. What if a non-Jew takes some grain, some kernels of wheat, and roasts them? This is a roasted grain, was considered a delicacy, a dessert back then, because when you roast it, it brings out the sweetness of the grain. So this is just toasted grains. Would you say then that also is prohibited because that's called cooked? Because it's not the same as it was in its raw form. And if you say that indeed that should be prohibited because they're no longer in their raw form once you cook them, but we have a baraita that says if a non-Jew took wheat and roasted it, it's permitted for a Jew to eat. So why is it permitted if it's not in its raw form? So we revise the comparison of food to water. Just like water does not change from its original state, so too, any food that's not changed from its original state is permitted. Now, roasting a wheat kernel doesn't change its the way it looks. It's still a wheat kernel. It's just you made it hot, so it's browned a little bit toasted, but it's still basically in the same form as it was. So we have a leniency now. It doesn't have to be totally raw like water is raw. It can be even cooked, parshed a little, as long as it's in the same form as it was when it grew. Now we say, according to this definition, if a non-Jew takes wheat and grinds it, he doesn't cook it at all, he just grinds it into flour. Would you say you're not allowed to buy flour from non-Jews? But we have a baraita that says that wheat that you turn into roasted grain and also flour and fine flour are all permitted. So flour is permitted even though it changes form. אלא כמים, מים שלא נשתן בריאתן על ידי האור, אף אוכל שלא נשתנה מבריאתו על ידי האור. Okay, so in order to accommodate for this baraita and the leniency that's in it, we have to reformulate the comparison to water. Just like water does not change from its original state through fire, even if you would heat up water, it just goes back to its original state. There's no change in it. So too, food is only permitted if it does not change from its original state with fire. That would mean if it's changed from its original state but not through fire, like grinding it, that is a change from its from the way it grew, that's permitted because it's not through fire. Only if there's, number one, fire involved, And number two, it's changed from its original state. Just roasting the wheat kernels, just toasting them, that would be also okay. So now we have these two leniencies that we had to build in because of the baraita, but we still have a comparison to water. Midi urketi, but now we question this. Now you've gotten pretty far from the original pasuk. Does the pasuk say anything about fire? It just says, Moshe said, give us food and give us water. It doesn't say anything about fire. So how could you read that in? Rather, in fact, this whole law of bishul goyim is only d'Rabbanan. The rabbis wanted to keep people away from eating together and socializing a lot. That would lead to intermarriage or taking on ways of idolatry. So this is D'Rabbanan Gezerah, and the fact that Rabbi Yochanan quoted the pasuk is just to give support to a Rabbanan. It's not the actual source, and therefore it doesn't really matter if the pasuk can handle all these meanings, and it doesn't say fire. It doesn't matter if it says fire or not. It's a mnemonic. You get to this pasuk, you say, oh, fire, what has to be like water? The food has to be like water. So it's a number one, a mnemonic, and also it gives support. If you tell people about this, and they say, oh, what's your source? Oh, we just made it up. So then I might not take it so seriously if it's just if the rabbis quote a pasuk. They say, oh, it's connected to a pasuk, so it's giving it support, even though the pasuk is not actually the source of the prohibition. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak Amar Rav Kol nechal kemo shehu chai en bo mishum bishul legoyim besura bantu hachi. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak says the name of Rav. Rav is the first generation Amora in Bavel, in the city of Sura, is where his yeshiva, where his students were, and he says another limitation: anything that can be eaten raw, there's no problem of eating it if a non-Jew cooked it. So if you take like basic vegetables like carrots, carrot you can eat raw. Therefore, if a non-Jew cooks carrots, you can still eat it because the fact that he cooked it was already edible before. That's the version of Rav that was taught later on in the school in Surah. Bepumpedita matnu hachi amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak amar Rav kol she'eno ne'echal al shulchan melachim lelapet bo tapat en bo mishum bishulei goyim. In Pumpedita, another yeshiva, they also transmitted this teaching of Rav, but in a different version. And they said anything that is not eaten on a table of kings, together with the bread that they used to eat, mostly not with utensils, but with pita bread, and they dip it in lots of different things, and hummus, and meat, and fish, or whatever that they would dip it in. Anything that is not fit for a king's table, you don't have to worry about cooking of non-Jews. If the non-Jew is just making a simple dish, a poor man's dish, something very basic that would not go on a king's table, that's not going to lead to so much socializing. Socializing in the way that are worried about is in a more formal meal. So that would mean that if it's something that's more of a fancy dish, then it's a problem. But if it's a not fancy dish, then even though the non-Jew cooked it, it's permitted. My benayu, what would be a practical difference between these two reasons? Ika benayu dagim ketanim ve'ardeh ve'daisa. Difference would be small fish, mushrooms, and porridge. All of these things can not be eaten raw. And therefore, according to the first definition in Surah, this would be a problem. You can't eat small fish raw or mushrooms or porridge raw. You have to cook them, and therefore it would be prohibited. However, all of these items also are not very fancy. Small fish, mushrooms, porridge. Nowadays, mushrooms, you could go to a restaurant and they charge you $40 for a mushroom. But in the olden days, mushrooms and porridge were not fancy foods that would go on a king, and therefore, according to the people in Pumbedita, these things, even if they were cooked by non-Jews, would be permitted. But according to the version in Surah, since they are not edible raw, they would be prohibited if a non-Jew cooked them. Amar Rav Aseh Amar Rav Dagim ketanim meluchim en bahem mishum bishulei goyim. Another law in the name of Rav, that small fish that are salted if a non-Jew would cook them after they're salted, it's permitted. Now, we just said that salted fish are not eaten by kings. According to that opinion, salted fish should be no problem, even if the non-Jew cooked them outright. But we're talking about according to the version of Rav in Surah that says the criteria is that they cannot be eaten raw. Therefore, if you have raw small fish and a non-Jew cooks them, this is prohibited. However, if first they are salted, and seems according to most opinions, what doesn't matter if they're salted by a Jew or a non-Jew. We're not allowed to eat things that are cooked by a non-Jew, but something salted by a non-Jew, that's okay. And these small fish are such that if you just salt them, you cure them in salt, then they become edible even without adding any heat, even without cooking. Therefore, if someone, even if a non-Jew, salts them, and now they're edible, and then after they're in their edible state, a non-Jew cooks them, then it's okay to eat them, even according to in the rabbis in Surah, because first it was made edible, not through cooking, but by salting, and now it's cooked by a non-Jew, but it was edible without the cooking, so therefore the cooking didn't make it edible, so it's permitted. Amar Rav Yosef, im sela'an goy, somech Yisrael lahen mishum erubeh tabshilin, v'yabdinhu goy, kasa deharsena asur. Rav Yosef adds two interesting laws, that if you had this salted fish and then a non-Jew cooked it, a Jew can not only eat it, as we just said, but also can use it for eruv tavshilin. If you have a holiday, but right on Friday, right before Shabbat, and you want to be able to cook from the holiday to Shabbat, you have to make an eruv tavshilin by leaving aside a cooked dish from before the holiday. It has to be a cooked dish. Now, you might think, well, this fish was first salted, and so the cooking did not make it edible, so maybe it cannot be used for eruv tavshilin. Rav Yosef says it can be used for eruv tavshilin. So you have the benefit both ways, the kula both ways. On the one hand, it was already edible by being salted. Therefore, the cooking does not make it prohibited. As bishul goyim, we rely on the salting, it was already edible. On the other hand, even though it was already edible, but now it's also cooked, so it's considered a cooked dish for the law of eruv tavshilin. And Rav Yosef adds another law that if one takes these small salted fish that are already edible and he turns them into a dish called kasa de harsena, which is fried fish in oil and flour, then they are prohibited. Peshita, we ask, isn't that obvious? Mahu detema harsena ikar, kamashmalan kimcha ikar. No, it's not obvious. I mean, you would think it's obvious because, well, the non-Jew's cooking it. But it's not obvious because you might think that the fish, the salted fish, is the main thing, and the salted fish was already edible before, and the fact that he's cooking it more shouldn't matter, and therefore be permitted. And the flour is just a side dish and is not considered essential. So if the flour is not essential, then it doesn't matter. And so therefore, Rav Yosef comes to teach us not so. When you make this fried fish in some kind of batter with flour and oil, then the flour is considered an essential component to it. It's not just a by-the-way ingredient that's added on the side, but rather is the main ingredient, and because flour is not edible at all raw, but now by cooking it, it becomes edible, that's why this kasa de harsena, even though it's made with fish that was already edible by being salted, but the fact that you added flour now makes the whole dish prohibited. Amar Rav Beruna Amar Rav Goy shesita taor ba'agam kol hachagabim sheba'agam asurin. Rav Beruna says, also in the name of Rav, that if a non-Jew set fire to a meadow, his goal is to clear the meadow. He wants to take away all the weeds and clear the area. And there's locusts in there that are in the meadow. And once he lights it on fire, all the locusts get burnt and nice and toasted. And some of them might be kosher locusts. Some of them might be non-kosher locusts. So the law is that all of the locusts that are there are prohibited. Now what is the case? If, what's the problem? Is the problem that now that they're all burnt by fire, we can't tell anymore which ones are kosher and which ones are not kosher. When you have them raw, you could look at them. We saw before, you have to look at the wings and see exactly what their shape is. So now that they're burnt, maybe the wings are no longer intact and we can't tell which is which, and that's why they're all prohibited. But if so, what does it matter if a non-Jew burnt it? It doesn't really matter who started the fire. If a Jew burnt it also, everything would be prohibited because we can't tell if they're kosher. Rather, it must be because this is called bishul goyim. The non-Jew started the fire and toasted all of these locusts. So even if you know that they're all kosher, nevertheless, it was cooked by a non-Jew. And locusts, you can't eat them raw. Apparently, I don't know if they are served to kings. Maybe they are. But anyway, according to the other definition, they're not eaten raw, and now a non-Jew cooked them, and that must be the reason that is prohibited. The chidush is, even though the non-Jew did not have in mind to cook them, his goal was to burn down the field. He didn't care about cooking the locusts. Still, they were cooked by the non-Jew starting the fire and are prohibited. But we challenge that. In a case like this, would it really be prohibited if the non-Jew didn't even have in mind to be cooking anything? Yochanan. Hai goy decharech resha, share lemechal mineh afilu meresh uneh. Alma le'abure se'ar kamikaven, hachaname legaluye agma kamichaven. We have a statement by Rav Chanan bar Ameh, and the name would be Pedat, the name would be Yochanan, that if a non-Jew singes the head of an animal, his purpose of singeing it is to remove the hairs. You singe it just a little bit, and the fire goes and removes the hairs. And then he'll, cook the rest of the head some other way. So all he did was singe it to remove the hairs. Now, while he's singeing it, still, some of the outer parts of the head will get cooked, like the ears. The tips of the ears are going to cook quickly because they're all the way on at the edge and cook quickly. So therefore, he rules that a Jew is permitted to eat from the tip of the ear. We're talking about a kosher animal. It was a kosher slaughter, but the non-Jew is the one that's singeing it in the fire, and the ears got nice and cooked. A Jew can eat them. Therefore, we learn that because his intention was simply to remove the hair and not to cook it, therefore it's permitted to eat. So too here, the intention of the non-Jew in burning down the field is to clear the meadow. His intention was not to to cook the locusts, and therefore it should be permitted to eat the locusts. So we reject this interpretation of the statement of Rav. And so we answer, Le'olam de la yadahet tahor vehet tameh. Maseh haya shaya begoy haya. Rather, it must be that when Rav said you cannot eat any of the locusts in the field, actually the reason is because now that they're burnt, we don't know which one is kosher and which one's not kosher. And that what you asked, well, what does it matter if a non-Jew burned it down? If a Jew burnt it, also it would be prohibited. Indeed, that is so. But the case that actually happened, that came before Rav, happened to be a non-Jew. So that's why we report it in that that a non-Jew burnt it down. But you're right, it would be the same law if a Jew or a non-Jew burnt it down. So we see that the reason for the locust is not because of Bishul Goyim, but rather because we don't know which one is kosher and not kosher. And the conclusion now would be that if a non-Jew cooked something unknowingly, he really meant to do something else, and something happened to get cooked, then it's permitted to eat that. Gufa. And we go further into the statement. Amar Rabba bar Yochanan. Going back to the statement of Rabbi Yochanan that a non-Jew who singes the head of an animal to remove its hairs, a Jew is permitted to eat any part of it that became cooked, even the tips of the ear that are totally cooked, and all the more so some other part that might be less cooked. Amar Ravina Hilkach ay goy dishdat siketa la'atuna ukvar ba'Yisrael kara me'ikara shapir dameh. So Ravina says we can learn from this that if a non-Jew took a peg and put it into the oven because he wanted it to harden, he wants a peg, he's going to use it to build something as a carpenter, and he put it in the oven to dry it out and make it hard, and happened to be that a Jew had put a gourd into the oven beforehand. Beforehand, the oven was not hot enough to cook the gourd, but it was just sitting there in the oven. And now this non-Jew came, and he's not oblivious of the gourd, and he puts this peg into the oven and makes it hot. So the non-Jew effectively is cooking the gourd, but it's permitted because the non-Jew did not have in mind that he was cooking the gourd, but rather He was simply hardening this peg. Pishita, isn't this obvious? Well, we might have thought it's prohibited because maybe you would call that cooking the vessel. You're putting the vessel into an oven. So do you call that cooking because you're going to soften it? And it teaches us no. His intention was to harden it. So you don't call that cooking, and therefore the fact that the gourd got cooked on the side doesn't matter. We would learn from here that, let's say the gourd was in the oven and then the non-Jew took a food, another dish, put it in the oven and cooked it. His intention is to cook, so the fact that something else got cooked would be a problem. It's only okay over here because his intention was not to cook at all. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Hinech Yisrael basar al gabech alim, uba goy ve'afach bo mutar. Shmuel says that if a Jew puts meat on coals, and then a non-Jew comes and flips it over. He's helping out. It's permitted because the Jew put it on in the first place. We ask, what exactly would be the case? If it's a case where, even if the non-Jew had not turned it over, it would have cooked just fine, then obviously the non-Jew didn't add anything. So it would have cooked just fine. The non-Jew didn't do anything significant, so of course it would be permitted. Rather, maybe it's a case where if the non-Jew had not flipped it over, it would not have cooked. Well, in that case, why is it permitted? Now, because if by the Jew's action, it would not have been cooked sufficiently, and the non-Jew's action made it now cooked, so it should be prohibited. That is the definition of something cooked by a non-Jew. Rather, it must be the case of Shemuel is where if the non-Jew had not flipped it over, it would have been cooked through and through, but it would have taken longer. It would have taken 2 hours. But by flipping it over, now it's going to cook only in 1 hour. I might have thought that making the cooking process faster is a significant matter and would make it prohibited for Bishul Goyim, and that's why Shemuel tells us not so. As long as it would have cooked eventually by the Jew's action, it's permitted even if a non-Jew makes it go faster. So a non-Jew can have a hand in the cooking process as long as the Jew also has a hand and does, by the Jew's action, would be sufficient eventually. But the Hold on. Rabbi Yochanan says, as long as something is cooked sufficient that Ben Durusai would eat it. Ben Durusai was this bandit. And because he's always on the run, he doesn't have time to sit and cook his food thoroughly. So Ben Durusai would eat things that are half cooked. Most people would say this is disgusting, so it's like the minimum amount that something would be cooked that is even edible by anyone. Rabbi Yochanan says anything that's cooked, let's say it's half cooked, 50%, as long as it's half cooked, and then it's already okay if a non-Jew cooks it more. As long as a Jew cooked it 50%, there's no problem of Bishul Goyim. So what do we learn from here? That if it's cooked less than Ben Durusai, 40%, and then a non-Jew comes and cooks it more and makes it fully cooked, then it is a problem. So this seems to contradict what we said over here, because over here it sounds like this item was not yet cooked. It was only 30%, 40% cooked, and the non-Jew, then his action made it fully cooked, so it should be a problem. And the answer is hatam kegon deotve besilta v'shakle goy ve'otve betanura. No, this statement of Rabbi Yasen and Rabbi Yochanan was a case where the Jew, he cooked some meat on the barbecue, only 40%, and then put it on a basket on the side. So nothing, that's it. It was just going to stay in that too raw state. And then a non-Jew came and put it back on the oven and then brought it from 40% to 100% cooked. And so that would be a problem because it was not edible before and now it is edible. Whereas the case of Shemuel was not like that. The case of Shemuel was on the stove the whole time. It was on the barbecue. And although it was only at 40% when the non-Jew flipped it over, but even if you had left it there, it would have eventually cooked fully. And therefore, it's okay because the non-Jew just helped it get cooked faster, but it would have cooked in it right there in its place. That's different from if it was taken off altogether and put in a basket before it was 50% cooked. Tanya, we have a braita that supports what we just said. מניח ישראל בשר על גבי גחלים, ובא גוי מהפך בו, עד שבו יישא מבית הכנסת ובית המדרש ואינו חושש. A Jew can put a meat on coals, and the non-Jew can go and flip it over, take care of it, until the Jew goes to Bet Knesset or to Bet Midrash to pray or to learn, and then he comes back, and that's no problem. As long as a Jew did an initial action of putting the meat on to the griddle, and it would have cooked there by itself. The fact that the non-Jew is attending to it and helping it cook well and cook faster, that's okay. Shofetet isha kedra gabe kira ubat goya ומגיסה עד שתבוא מבית המרחץ או מבית הכנסת ואינה חוששת. Or, Baraita continues and says, a woman can put a pot on the stove and the non-Jew can go and stir it until she goes to the bathhouse or to the Bet Knesset to pray, and you don't have to worry because the woman, the Jewish woman, put it on the stove in the first place, so the non-Jew can stir it, make it good, make it cook faster, and there's no problem. I think it's interesting that the woman here is cooking on the stove and the man is doing the barbecue, so I guess some roles never change. Now a question: what if a non-Jew put it on the fire, and the Jew came after and flipped it over? How about that case? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kal v'chomer gemaro b'yad goy mutar, gemaro b'yad Yisrael lo kol sheken. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says it's the kal v'chomer that is permitted. If a Jew started off the process and a non-Jew finished it, that's the case that we had before, and that was okay, then all the more so if a non-Jew started the process and a Jew finished it. The Jew is the one that then flipped it over and made it come to its complete cooking status. So all the more so, the completion is more important than the beginning. So that certainly would be permitted. Ben שהניח גוי והפך ישראל, בין שהניח ישראל והפך גוי, מותר. ואינו אסור עד שתהא תחילתו וגמרו ביד גוי. We have another statement by Rabbi Yochanan that supports what we just said. And it doesn't matter whether the non-Jew places the meat on the barbecue and then the Jew flips it over, or the Jew puts it on the barbecue and the non-Jew flips it over. Both of those cases are permitted. The only case that would be a problem is if the non-Jew placed it and finished it. Then the Jew is not involved in any part of the process. Then it's prohibited. Amar Ravina hilcheta hayrifta deshigar goy v'afa Yisrael ina meshigar Yisrael v'afa goy ina meshigar goy v'afa goy v'ata Yisrael v'chata ba chatuye shapir dameh. Ravina says the halacha is that if you have bread baked in an oven and the non-Jew lit the oven, but then the Jew put the bread in, that's okay. Or if the Jew is the one that lit the oven and the non-Jew put the bread in to bake, that's also okay. Or if the non-Jew lit the oven and the non-Jew also put the bread in, and all the Jew did is he came later on and he stoked the coals to heat the fire while it was cooking, that's also okay. So Ravina says, right, even the non-Jew can be doing most of the process as long as the Jew does something by stoking the coals, making the fire a little better, that will make it cook a little bit faster. That's sufficient to make it permitted. Dag Maliach, Chizkiah Shareh, Rabbi Yochanan Asar. These small fish that are salted and they are edible once they're salted, Chizkiah permits them, as we said before, because Chizkiah says, as we said before, that salting is not called cooking. Rabbi Yochanan, however, prohibits them. Seems according to Rabbi Yochanan, salting is also considered part of this prohibition. It's preparing food, even if it's not by heat but by salting, and making it from not edible to edible. Rabbi Yochanan prohibits. Rabbi Seluya bar kapara sharev Rabbi Yochanan asar. A roasted egg bar kapara permits someone to eat, a Jew to eat a roasted egg that was roasted by a non-Jew. Rabbi Yochanan prohibits. It seems that the machloket is about the status of an egg. Can an egg be eaten raw? Well, you can eat it raw. So Bar Kapara says, since you can eat a raw egg, therefore it's okay if the non-Jew cooks it. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, very few people eat raw eggs, and therefore it's considered going from non-edible to edible. Ki atarav dimi amar, echad dag maliach v'echad besasuri Chizkiah Bar Kapara sharu, v'Rabbi Yochanan asar. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he reported that, although we said before here, Chizkiah is one that permits this and Bar Kapara permits that, Rabbi Yochanan prohibits both, but in fact Chizkiah and Bar Kapara, they both agree regarding both issues of the salted fish and the roasted egg. Both of them say that they're permitted, and Rabbi Yochanan prohibits both of them. Rabbi Chia parva'a ikla leberesh galuta. Amru le besa seluya mai. One time Rabbi Chia parva'a went to the home of the Resh Galuta, that's the exilarch. He's the most important and powerful Jew in Bavel, represents the entire Jewish community. He would be powerful and a wealthy person. He would have had a very nice home. And sometimes he got along with the Resh Galuta, had good relations with the rabbis. Sometimes there was some tension between the Resh Galuta and the sages. Anyway, one time when Rabbi Chia Parva'a went to his house, the people in his house asked Rabbi Chia, what is the law regarding a non-Jew who roasts an egg? Is it permitted for a Jew to eat? Amar lehu Chizkiah bar Kapara sharu Rabbi Yochanan asar v'en Rav shelechad b'mkom shenayim. Rabbi Chia said, well, we have two sages, Chizkiah and Bar Kapara, they both permit. Rabbi Yochanan says it's prohibited. And we're not going to follow the opinion of the minority single person. When there's two, you're going to follow the majority, and therefore it's permitted. Amar lu Rav Zavid, la tesitu le hachi amar Abaye l'chata kevated Rabbi Yochanan. However, Rav Zavid said, don't listen to what Rabbi Chia said, because Abaye said that the halacha follows Rabbi Yochanan, even though he's a minority opinion, but he's the greater sage, and therefore a roasted egg is prohibited. Ashkiyu nekota techala v'nach nafshe. The people in the house of the exilarch did not want to hear the answer that Rav Zavid said, because he says it's prohibited, and so they took care of it the old-fashioned way. They gave Rav Zavid a cup of spiced vinegar, which is poisonous, and they assassinated Rav Zavid. This is quite an astounding story. It's one thing to shop for a kulot, but another thing to assassinate a sage who says that something is prohibited. But it gives you a sense of the violent tactics that sometimes the Resh Galuta would use to get their way. So whether that story is literal or not, it does show that this was a very contentious issue. Tenor Rabbanan, hakafrisin, v'akaflotot, v'hamatliya, v'chamin, v'kelayot shelahen mutarin. Besa seluya asura. Shemen, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi ubetino nimnu alav. Vehitiruhu, Braita teaches that caper buds and leeks and matalya. These are all various items that can be eaten raw, and therefore, even if they're cooked, they are permitted. And also hot water, well, water doesn't change. You can eat it, have it raw, so that's okay. And roasted grains, that's what we started off with. Roasted grains is in the same form as it is when it starts off. It's just a little toasted, and therefore these are all permitted. And egg that's roasted by a non-Jew is prohibited, as we saw above regarding Rabbi Yochanan. And oil that's produced by non-Jews, we already discussed that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his court took a vote and they permitted it. Tanya. He hamatliya, he pashalia, he shi'ata. There's a baraita that teaches that this thing, matliya, that we mentioned in the previous baraita, is the same thing as black-eyed peas, and it's also called shi'ata. My shi'ata, where is this shi'ata? Amar Rabba bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan ha'rebe'in shenin denefek hai Avoda mitzrayim. Rabba bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it's been 40 years since this plant has been imported from Egypt. Rabba bar Chana hadideh amar ha'shetin shenin denefek hai Avoda mitzrayim. Rabba bar Chana himself said that it's been 60 years since this plant was imported from Egypt. Vela pilige, mor bishne or mor bishne. There's no argument between them. Each one was quoting the number of years at the time that he said it. Rabbi Yochanan is an earlier sage, so when Rabbi Yochanan said this, it was in fact 40 years since it was imported. This was reported by Rabba bar Chana, and he said it 20 years later. So when he said it in the name of his teacher, Rabbi Yochanan, he said 40 years, because he's repeating exactly how his teacher said it. But when he said it himself, without quoting Rabbi Yochanan, then he said it's been 60 years, because he said that 20 years later. Maitu bizra de charpasa, bizra de chitna, ubizra de shablilta, vetaru lehu behade hadade, bifshure, veshabkule ad de mikabel. And now the Gemara describes how you prepare this shi'ata. You take parsley seeds and flax root and fenugreek root and soak them together in lukewarm water, and you leave them until they sprout. Umaite chatzbe chadte, מומלו להו מיה ותרו בהו גרגשתה ומדבקין בה ואלין לבה בנה עד נפקו מלב לבה ואכלי מיניהו וקיירי מבינתה דרשייהו עד תופרה דחרעיהו. And then you take new earthenware pots, fill them with water, and soak red clay in them, stick the seeds and the roots in the clay, and then they leave it. They go to the bathhouse. By the time they come out of the bathhouse, just a couple of hours later, the plants already blossom and they eat from the plants. And they're very helpful because they cool down the people from the heat of the bathhouse. People would get very hot and feverish from the steam of the bathhouse. And then by eating this, fast-growing plants, they are cooled down from the hair of their heads until their toenails. So what a fantastic plant this is. Amar Rav Asher, Amar li Rabbi Chanina milin, v'amri la be-milin. Now, if you think this is unbelievable, then so did Rav Asher. He said that Rabbi Chanina told him, these are only words. Someone just made up these words. This is not a real thing. This is just a legend. But another version says be-milin with magic words. In order to make this grow so fast, it actually involves magic. Tenor Rabbanan, hakuspan shel goyim shuchmu chamin, beyora gedola asur beyora ketana mutar. Ve'ezu yora ketana, amar biyanai, kol shen sipor deror yachol likanes betocha. A Braita teaches that with regard to date husks, which are not edible by themselves, but if they're cooked, then they can be consumed. So if they were heated up in hot water, are they kosher? It depends. If it's in a large pot, prohibited. If it's in a small pot, then it's permitted. Why? Well, the big pots non-Jews would use to cook non-kosher food, which were big items, big animals and big birds, so they put them in, they use these big pots. Therefore, those pots are likely not kosher and will give taste to the date husks. However, if the non-Jew cooks it in a small pot, small pots were not generally used for cooking their non-kosher big items, and therefore the small pots are permitted. Now, how small does it need to be considered permitted? Rabbi Yanai says, as long as a swallow cannot enter it. A swallow, not a kosher bird, so if they would cook such a bird, they would have to put it in the big pot. If it's too small that it couldn't fit a swallow, then it's they probably did not use it for non-kosher, and therefore you can use the date husks that they cook in it. Hold on, maybe the non-Jews slice up the things that they're eating and put it into a small pot. Even a large item, animal or bird, you can slice up into small parts and put it into small pots. So the small pots also should be prohibited. Rather, we have to change the size. When we say small enough, it means that even the head of a swallow cannot fit into it. That's the smallest part. You're not going to slice that into further pieces. So if it can't fit the head of a swallow, then we can assume that they did not use that small pot for non-kosher. So then you can eat the husks that were cooked in it. But a bigger pot is no good. Hold on, we have a contradictory baraita that says both a big pot and a small pot are permitted. If a non-Jew cooked kosher items, date husks, in a pot, no matter if big or small, it's permitted. How come we don't worry about the taste of the non-kosher food that might have been cooked in it before? So there's no problem. The baraitot are following different opinions about whether taste that is a bad taste is permitted or not. So the first baraita that says if it's a big pot, it's not allowed, that follows the opinion that says bad, even taste that's detrimental. You can assume that once you didn't use a pot for 24 hours, any taste that might be swallowed up in the walls of the pot, once they come out again after 24 hours, is going to contribute a bad taste. And so a bad taste is still prohibited, and therefore, even though it might have been more than 24 hours, and we can assume that it was more than 24 hours, people usually cook from one day to the next, but not a lot of times on the same day, and therefore it's still prohibited, even if it was used more than 24 hours ago. And that's why the big pot is prohibited in the first baraita. And this baraita here that says it's permitted, that follows the opinion that says if as long as it's a detrimental taste, then it's permitted, even though it's giving some taste from the non-kosher food. So therefore the big pot, even if you know that it was used for non-kosher before, but now it's going to give a bad taste, so it's okay. Amarav Sheshat, Hai Mishcha Shelikad Arma'eh Asur. Rav Sheshat says oil that was cooked by non-Jews is prohibited. It's cooked. Amarav Safra Lemay Nechushla. Imishum I Arube Misra Sareh. Imishum Bishule Goyim Nechal Hu Kemochu Chai. Imishum Ge'ole Goyim Noten Tam Nifgam Hu Umutar. However, Rav Safra disagreed with Rav Sheshet. He says, what are you worried about? Are you worried that someone's going to mix wine that was yayin nesech into the oil? Can't be, because wine will ruin the oil. So nobody would do that. Are you worried about it being cooked by non-Jews? But oil can be eaten raw, and therefore it's permitted even if it's cooked. Are you worried about the pots that have a taste swallowed into them, and you have to purge the pots, kosher them? But we follow that detrimental taste is permitted, and therefore Rav Safra says no, there's nothing to worry about. So, question that was brought to Rabbi Aseh: boiled dates that are owned and boiled by non-Jews. What do you say about that? Chuliet, doesn't matter who owns them. They're boiled, they're cooked by non-Jews. Can you have dates? Are they edible in their raw state or not? If they're edible in the raw state, then it's permitted, otherwise not. So the answer is it depends. If it's talking about sweet dates, those are permitted because you can eat sweet dates raw, and therefore, if it's cooked by a non-Jew, it's also okay. Bitter dates cannot be eaten raw, only cooked, and therefore those would be prohibited as bishul goyim. Mai. Amar lehu, mai tiba'e lehu, Rabbi Asar umanu levi. But the question is about the medium ones. Maybe you could eat them. They're like not so sweet, but they're not so bitter. What about the middle ones? And his answer was, my teacher told me that such things are prohibited. And who is his Rabbi Aseh's teacher? It is Levi. So we have to be stringent about those medium dates. Shetita'a Rav Shareh Abu Dishmael Velevi Asre. Regarding this sweet porridge made from roasted grains and honey, Rav permitted a Jew to eat it, even if it was made by non-Jews, but the father of Shemuel and Levi prohibited it. Now, even though the ingredients are kosher, we are afraid that it will get mixed up with a similar dish that the non-Jew puts vinegar in, and vinegar would be made from wine, which is yayin nesech. So that's the machloket here. Bichi tevesare kule amala pligi de share. Betal peche de chala kule amala pligi de asir. Ki pelige betal peche de maya. Mor sabar gazrinan ha atuha. Or mor sabar la gazrinan. So there are many ways to make this porridge dish. And everybody agrees that if you make this shitita'ah out of wheat or barley, it's permitted because all those ingredients are going to be fine. And everybody agrees that if you make it with lentil and vinegar, then it's certainly prohibited because the non-Jew who makes it is going to put vinegar, which is not kosher. Everybody agrees on that. They disagree regarding if you make it with lentils and water, where Levi says, well, that's going to be similar because this is lentils and lentils. People are going to mix up lentils and water with the lentils and vinegar. If you say this one is allowed, they're going to think the vinegar one is allowed. Therefore, the lentil one is prohibited. However, the other sage, Rav, says that you're not going to make a gezerah. You'll know it. Check which one it is. Is it made with vinegar one or The water one, if it's made out of water, then is permitted, and that's what Rav said is permitted, and Levi said is prohibited. Or another version of their machloket, if it's made out of lentils and water, everybody agrees it's prohibited, because the one with lentils and water is too similar to the one with lentils and vinegar, and people will definitely get mixed up, so that's not allowed. And rather, the machloket is about the porridge that's made with wheat and barley, where one sage, that's the father of Shemuel and Levi, they say it's prohibited because even though it's made out of not of lentils but with wheat and barley, still people are going to get mixed up. It's still called shetita'ah, and therefore make a gezerah across the board. Whereas Rav says, no, we do not make a gezerah. Amar Rav, tere mine shetita'ah shedar Barzilai gil'adi leDavid. And now a side point that there are these two types of porridge. Barzilai sent to David when David was on the run because of rebellion of his son, and he and his troops needed food. Barzilai Giladi sent lots of food to them. Tichti mishkav v'sapot uchli yosed chitim v'sorim kemach v'kali uful v'adashim v'kali. The pasuk in Shemuel says Barzilai sent beds, basins, earthenware vessels, wheat and barley and meal, parched grain and beans and lentils, and parched pulse. So we see that after the wheat and barley, it talks about meal, that's one type of porridge, and after the lentils, it talks about another parched pulse, which is another type of porridge made out of lentils. Hashta hu deka mapeki saneh saneh l'shuka dinahardea v'letechayish leha de'abud Shmuel v'Levi. Nowadays, we see that shetita'ah is taken out in baskets upon basketfuls to the marketplace of Nahardea, and no one is concerned with the stringent ruling of Shmuel's father and Levi, even though these are being cooked by non-Jews. So, and there's tons of it in the marketplace. We follow the lenient ruling. The next item in the Mishnah is boiled and pickled vegetables, where the usual way of pickling those vegetables is to add wine or vinegar to them, and therefore they are prohibited. Amar Chizkiah lo shanu ela shedarkan, aval biyadua asur afilu b'hana'ah. Chizkiah says, when the Mishnah is listing all things that are prohibited to eat, but you can get benefit from it. So the reason why you can get benefit from it is because you don't know for sure. These are the types of vegetables that usually people pickle with wine or vinegar, and therefore we're going to prohibit eating. But we're not sure that they use wine or vinegar, therefore it's permitted to have benefit from it. But if you know that this particular batch was made by non-Jews with wine or vinegar, then indeed you cannot even benefit from it, because that's yayin nesech. Now, how is this different from the fish stew, where also, if it's made by non-Jews and they put the wine in it to make the smell not so bad because of the bad fish smell, there the rabbi said you can't consume it, but you can get benefit. What's the difference between these? If you know that they put wine in it, this should also be prohibited to benefit. And the answer is, no, in that case of the fish stew, the wine is in it only to remove the stench. And so therefore, it's not really there for itself to add good flavor, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it, but it's okay to get benefit. However, here, with the pickling, the wine is there to make it taste good. You want that good taste of the wine, and therefore, if you know they put wine, you're not allowed to get even benefit from it. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Chizkiah, and he says regarding the pickled vegetables, even if you know that they put wine or vinegar in it, it's permitted to get benefit from it. Now, how is that different from the fish stew, which, according to the Rabbi Meir, fish stew that has wine in it is prohibited even to get benefit from it? So how come the fish stew is more stringent than the pickled vegetables? And the answer is hatam yediyat mamasho hacha la yediyat mamashan. It says there in the fish stew, the wine is recognizable. It's put it there. And even though it's not there for taste, but just to get rid of the smell, still it is recognizable. So therefore, the Rabbi Meir says we have to be stringent and not get benefit even from that fish stew. Whereas here, in the pickled vegetables, the substance is not recognizable anymore. It soaks in it soaks up the wine, but then you take it out and you don't see the wine anymore. And therefore, we can be more lenient and prohibit only eating, but permit getting benefit. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.